Standing in the lobby of the Marriott downtown, signing the papers that would make me the owner of 6 commercial buildings on Main Street, I couldn't help but smile at the irony. The same street where my sister Rebecca had cornered me 15 years ago, her finger jabbing at my chest as she hissed those words that would haunt and fuel me for the next decade and a half. "You'll never leave this town, Marcus. Face it. You're stuck here forever, just like the rest of us losers." "Well, Rebecca," I thought as I handed the signed documents back to my attorney, turns out I didn't just leave. I came back and bought the place. My name is Marcus Thompson. I'm 33 years old, and from the window of my Tesla Model S, the small town of Millbrook, Ohio looks exactly the same as it did when I was 18, except now I own half of it. But to understand how a kid who couldn't afford college tuition became the largest commercial property owner in a town of 8,000 people, you need to go back with me. Back to the suffocating summer heat of 2009, back to when I was 18 and desperate, back to the night my own sister tried to destroy my dreams before they could even take root. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Millbrook, Ohio was the kind of place where ambition went to die. Nestled between endless cornfields and a defunct steel mill that had closed when I was 12, it was a town that existed in a perpetual state of resigned acceptance. The population sign at the town limits had read 8,247 for as long as I could remember, though everyone knew the real number was probably closer to 7,800. People didn't move to Millbrook, they got trapped there. The downtown consisted of a single main drag lined with red brick buildings that had seen better days sometime around 1965. Thompson's Hardware, no relation to my family despite the name, sat next to Mel's Diner, where the coffee was always burnt and the gossip was always fresh. There was Peterson's Grocery, where Mrs. Peterson had been working the same register for 30 years, and Martinez Auto Repair, where old Joe Martinez could fix anything with an engine, but couldn't fix the rust eating away at his own building. Most of the storefronts had for lease signs that had become as permanent as the bricks themselves. The movie theater had closed when I was in middle school, leaving behind a marquee that still advertised The Dark Knight, even though it was now 2009. The only businesses that seemed to thrive were Murphy's Bar and the 3 gas stations that served the truckers passing through on Route 18. This was the world I knew, the world that had shaped me, and according to everyone I'd ever met, the world I was destined to never leave. My family lived in a narrow 2-story house on Elm Street, the kind of working-class neighborhood where the American dream had come to take a very long nap. The houses were built in the 1940s for the steel mill workers, solid structures with small yards and smaller ambitions. Our house was painted a faded yellow that my mother had chosen 15 years earlier during a brief period of optimism. Now it just looked tired. Inside, the furniture was a mismatched collection of hand-me-downs and discount store purchases. The living room carpet, a brown shag that had probably been installed during the Carter administration, bore the permanent stains of family life, spilled juice, muddy shoes, and the general wear of people who couldn't afford to replace things just because they looked bad. My father, Robert Thompson, worked at the grain elevator on the outskirts of town. He'd been there for 22 years, ever since the steel mill closed and took his previous job with it. Dad was a quiet man who came home every evening covered in grain dust, washed his hands at the kitchen sink, and settled into his recliner with a beer and whatever was on television. He wasn't unhappy exactly, but he carried himself with the weight of a man who had learned to expect disappointment. My mother, Linda, worked part-time at the local elementary school as a teacher's aide. She was the kind of woman who genuinely cared about everyone else's children but had somehow lost the energy to dream big dreams for her own. She moved through our house with efficient resignation, cooking dinner, doing laundry, and managing the endless small crises that came with raising 3 kids on a budget that never quite stretched far enough. Then there was Rebecca. Rebecca was 2 years older than me and had inherited all the family pessimism with an extra dose of bitterness thrown in for good measure. At 20, she worked the evening shift at Murphy's Bar, serving drinks to the same men who'd been drinking away their disappointments since before she was born. She had our mother's dark hair and our father's stubbornness, but she'd weaponized both into a sharp-edged cynicism that could cut through hope like a rusty blade. Rebecca had been the smart one in high school, the one teachers said had quote, potential. She'd gotten good grades, talked about going to college, maybe studying psychology or social work. But when graduation came, the reality of student loans and the uncertainty of leaving Millbrook had paralyzed her. Instead of taking the leap, she'd taken the job at Murphy's just for a year to save money. That was 3 years ago, and the saving money part had never quite materialized. Now she seemed to take a perverse satisfaction in the fact that she'd chosen to stay, as if settling for Millbrook was somehow a superior decision to struggling for something better. She'd developed a razor-sharp tongue for anyone who dared to dream beyond the town limits, as if their ambition was a personal insult to her own surrender. Our youngest sibling, Danny, was 15, and seemed blissfully unaware of the undercurrents of frustration that ran through our house. He was obsessed with video games and basketball, living in that blessed teenage bubble where the future was still an abstract concept rather than an approaching deadline. The summer of 2009 had been particularly brutal, both in terms of the heat and the economic climate. The recession had hit small towns like Millbrook especially hard. The grain elevator had cut Dad's hours, Mom's job at the school was constantly under threat of budget cuts, and Rebecca's tips at Murphy's had dwindled, as people had less money to spend on drinking away their troubles. It was against this backdrop of economic anxiety and generational stagnation that I dared to dream of something different. While my classmates were planning gap years that would inevitably become gap decades, or settling into entry-level jobs that would become their entire careers, I was obsessing over business magazines I'd borrowed from the public library and watching YouTube videos about entrepreneurship on the ancient computer in my bedroom. I had a secret that I'd been nurturing for months. I wanted to start a business. Not just any business, but something that could scale. Something that could grow beyond the artificial boundaries of Millbrook, Ohio. I'd been reading about e-commerce, about young entrepreneurs who'd built million-dollar companies from their dorm rooms or their parents' garages. I'd absorbed every piece of content I could find about digital marketing, dropshipping, and the emerging world of online retail. The idea that had captured my imagination was deceptively simple: a subscription box service for outdoor gear. I'd noticed that while Millbrook was surrounded by farmland, there were also state parks and hiking trails within driving distance that attracted weekend warriors from Columbus and Cleveland. These urban outdoors enthusiasts had money, but lacked the time to research and shop for specialized gear. I wanted to curate monthly boxes of high-quality, lesser-known outdoor products and market them to busy professionals who loved nature but hated shopping. I'd spent months researching suppliers, sketching out business plans in notebooks I hid under my mattress, and calculating startup costs on spreadsheets that I'd saved to a hidden folder on the family computer. I'd even reached out to a few small outdoor gear manufacturers who'd expressed interest in partnership deals for a subscription service. The problem was funding. My conservative estimate was that I needed $15,000 to get started, money for initial inventory, website development, packaging supplies, and marketing. It might as well have been $15 million. My family didn't have $15,000 sitting around, and at 18 with no credit history and no collateral, no bank was going to loan me money for a business plan sketched in spiral notebooks. But I'd found a potential solution. A business plan competition, sponsored by the regional community college. The winner would receive a $10,000 cash prize in mentorship from successful local entrepreneurs. It wasn't the full amount I needed, but it was a start. More importantly, it was validation that my idea wasn't completely insane. I had been working on my presentation for weeks, refining my pitch, creating slides on the ancient version of PowerPoint we had on our computer. The competition was next month, and I was convinced that this was my ticket out, not just out of Millbrook, but into a future I could build for myself. That's what made Rebecca's words so devastating when she finally discovered what I was planning. I should have known that in a house with thin walls and nosy siblings, my secret wouldn't stay secret for long. It was a sweltering Tuesday evening in July, when my carefully constructed world came crashing down. I'd been working on my presentation in my room, the fan blowing hot air around while I practiced my pitch for what felt like the 100th time. I must have been speaking louder than I thought, because when I finished my run-through and looked up, Rebecca was standing in my doorway. She wasn't just standing there, she was leaning against the frame with her arms crossed, a look of amused disbelief on her face that made my stomach drop. In her hand was one of my notebooks, the one where I'd written out my financial projections and marketing strategy. "So," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of condescension that only an older sibling can perfect. My little brother thinks he's going to be the next Steve Jobs. The way she said it, with that smirk playing at the corners of her mouth, I knew that everything I'd been working toward was about to be torn apart. This wasn't going to be a conversation about my business plan. This was going to be an execution. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Rebecca stepped fully into my room, closing the door behind her with a soft click that somehow felt more ominous than if she'd slammed it. She held up my notebook like it was evidence in a criminal trial, her eyes scanning the pages with theatrical interest. Adventure Gear Monthly, she read aloud, her voice mocking. Curated outdoor experiences delivered to your door. Oh, Marcus, this is rich. She flipped through the pages, stopping at my financial projections. $15,000 startup cost? Break-even analysis? Revenue projections? She laughed, but there was no humor in it. You actually think someone's going to give you 15 grand to Play Store? My face burned with embarrassment and anger. Give it back, Rebecca. That's private. Private? She raised an eyebrow. In this house? Come on, little brother, you know better than that. She sat down on my bed without invitation, making herself comfortable while she continued to rifle through my work. Let me guess. You're planning to present this to that business competition at the community college, right? The one they've been advertising on the radio? I said nothing, but my silence was answer enough. Marcus. She shook her head with exaggerated pity. Do you have any idea how naive this is? You think you're the first smart kid from Millbrook who thought he could outsmart his circumstances? It's a solid business plan, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I've done the research. The outdoor gear market is growing by 12% annually, and subscription services. Stop, Rebecca held up her hand. Just stop with the business school buzzwords. You sound like you swallowed a Forbes magazine. She leaned forward, her expression growing serious. Let me tell you what's really going to happen. You're going to get up there in front of those judges, local business owners who've probably never ordered anything online in their lives, and you're going to pitch them some cockamamie scheme about mailing camping gear to yuppies. They're going to smile politely, ask you a few questions you won't be able to answer, and then they're going to give the money to whoever's proposing something practical, like a new restaurant or a car wash. You don't know that, I protested, but doubt was already creeping into my voice. Don't I? Rebecca stood up and began pacing my small room, gesturing with my notebook. You know what your problem is, Marcus? You think you're special. You think because you read some articles and watched some YouTube videos, you understand how business works. But you don't understand the first thing about the real world. She stopped pacing and fixed me with a stare that made me feel like I was being dissected. You want to know what I see when I look at this business plan? I see a kid who's so desperate to be different from his family that he's willing to humiliate himself in public. You're not an entrepreneur, Marcus. You're a dreamer, and dreams don't pay bills. That's rich, coming from someone who's been slinging drinks at Murphy's for 3 years. I shot back, immediately regretting the words as soon as they left my mouth. Rebecca's face darkened. At least I'm realistic about my situation. At least I'm not living in some fantasy where I'm going to magically transform into Jeff Bezos because I figured out how to use Google. She threw my notebook back onto my desk. You want to know the difference between us? I learned to accept my limitations. You're still fighting yours. Maybe I don't want to accept limitations, I said, standing up to face her. Maybe I think there's more to life than serving drinks to the same drunk farmers every night and pretending that's enough. Oh, here we go. Rebecca crossed her arms again. The noble dreamer, too good for small-town life. Let me ask you something, Marcus. Where do you think this magical business of yours is going to operate from? Your bedroom? Mom and Dad's basement? Because last I checked, you don't have money for office space, and you sure as hell don't have money for a warehouse. I opened my mouth to respond, but she kept going. And what about when you need customer service? Marketing? Inventory management? You think you're going to handle all of that yourself, while working whatever minimum wage job you can find, to keep yourself fed? Because that's what's going to happen. You're going to realize that running a business takes money. Real money. Not just the 10 grand from some community college contest. Her words were hitting their mark, poking holes in the confidence I'd spent months building. But what hurt more than her logic was the venom behind it, the satisfaction she seemed to be taking in dismantling my dreams. You know what the worst part is? Rebecca continued, her voice growing more intense. It's not that you're going to fail. It's that you're going to fail spectacularly. In front of people who knew you when you were the kid who couldn't even keep a paper route going for more than 2 months. Remember that, Marcus? You quit because getting up early was too hard. I remembered. I'd been 13 and had given up the paper route after 6 weeks because I hated waking up at 5 a.m. It had seemed like such a small thing at the time, but now Rebecca was wielding it like a weapon. You think these judges don't know about that? You think they don't know that you've never held a real job, never managed employees, never dealt with suppliers or customers, or any of the 1,000 little problems that come up every day in business? They're gonna see right through you, Marcus. They're gonna see a kid playing dress-up in his daddy's suit pretending to be something he's not. You're wrong, I said, but my voice sounded weak even to me. Am I? Rebecca pulled out her phone and started scrolling. Let me show you something. These are the winners from the last 3 years of that competition. She turned the screen toward me. Sandra Mitchell, 2006, opened a daycare center. Still operating, serves local families. Tom Rodriguez, 2007, expanded his father's landscaping business, also still operating. Jennifer Walsh, 2008, opened a boutique fitness studio. Guess what? Still in business. All local customers, all serving the community they live in. She put her phone away and looked at me with what might have been pity. You see the pattern? These people succeeded because they understood their market. They knew their customers personally. They didn't try to reinvent the wheel. They just built better wheels for people they actually understood. The outdoor gear market. The outdoor gear market doesn't exist in Millbrook, Ohio, Rebecca's voice rose. It exists in Seattle and Boulder, and places where people have money to spend on hobbies. You're trying to serve customers you've never met, in markets you've never visited, selling products you've probably never even used yourself. When's the last time you went camping, Marcus? When's the last time you went hiking anywhere that wasn't the walking trail behind the elementary school? I felt my face burning because she was right. My outdoor experience was limited to the occasional fishing trip with Dad and a few camping trips with the Boy Scouts when I was younger. I'd been so focused on the business opportunity that I'd never really considered whether I was qualified to curate outdoor gear for serious enthusiasts. Here's what's really going to happen, Rebecca said, her voice getting quieter but more intense. You're going to get up there, give your little presentation, and lose. Then you're going to come home disappointed but not defeated, because you'll tell yourself the judges just didn't understand your vision. So you'll try again somewhere else, maybe enter another competition, or try to get a loan, or save up money from whatever job you manage to find. She sat back down on my bed, leaning forward with her elbows on her knees. And while you're chasing this impossible dream, your real life is going to pass you by. You'll miss opportunities for actual jobs, actual careers, actual relationships. Because you'll always be waiting for your big break. You'll become one of those guys who's always working on something, always about to make it big, always just one investor away from success. Her words painted a picture that terrified me because it felt possible, maybe even probable. In 5 years you'll still be here, Marcus. You'll be working at Peterson's Grocery, or helping Dad at the grain elevator, and you'll have a garage full of whatever inventory you managed to buy with your savings. You'll still be telling people about your business plan, about how you just need the right opportunity, the right partner, the right timing. She stood up and walked to my window, looking out at the street where I'd grown up. In 10 years, you'll be me, but worse. At least I accepted reality. You'll still be fighting it, still convinced that you're different, still believing that your big break is just around the corner. You'll be bitter and frustrated and alone, because who wants to date a guy who's 30 and still living in his childhood bedroom, still talking about the business he's going to start someday? Rebecca turned back to face me, and for the first time, her expression softened slightly. I'm not trying to be cruel, Marcus. I'm trying to save you from a decade of disappointment. There's nothing wrong with a normal life. There's nothing wrong with staying in Millbrook, getting a steady job, maybe finding a nice girl to settle down with. Mom and Dad aren't unhappy. They have a house, food on the table, each other. That's more than a lot of people have. But what if, I started. What if what? What if you're the 1 in a million who actually makes it big? What if you're the kid from small-town Ohio who builds a business empire? Rebecca shook her head. Those aren't odds worth betting your life on, Marcus. Those are lottery ticket odds. She walked toward my door, then paused with her hand on the knob. You want my advice? Skip the competition. Take the summer to find a real job, maybe at the hardware store or helping Joe Martinez at the auto shop. Learn a trade, something practical. Stop reading those business magazines and start reading want ads. Stop planning for some imaginary future and start building a real one. She opened the door, then looked back at me one more time. You'll never leave this town, Marcus. Face it, you're stuck here forever, just like the rest of us losers. The sooner you accept that, the sooner you can start building a life that actually makes sense. The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving me alone with my scattered notebooks and the crushing weight of her words. I sat down heavily on my bed, staring at the business plan that had consumed my thoughts for months. Every page, every calculation, every carefully crafted sentence suddenly looked naive and foolish. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was just a dreamer, too stubborn to see the obvious truth that everyone else had already accepted. Maybe the smart thing to do was to give up this fantasy and focus on finding my place in the world I'd been born into. But as I sat there in the suffocating heat of my childhood bedroom, surrounded by the artifacts of small-town resignation, something else began to kindle in my chest. It wasn't hope. Hope felt too fragile for what I was feeling. It was something harder, more durable. It was determination. The next morning I woke up with Rebecca's words echoing in my head like a hangover that wouldn't quit. You'll never leave this town, Marcus. Face it. You're stuck here forever, just like the rest of us losers. I lay in bed staring at the water stain on my ceiling, the same stain I'd been looking at every morning for 18 years, and felt the weight of inevitability pressing down on my chest. Downstairs, the family was going through their usual morning routine. Dad was at the kitchen table reading yesterday's newspaper, because we couldn't afford a subscription to get it delivered daily. Mom was packing lunches in brown paper bags, the same routine she'd been following since I was in kindergarten. Danny was scarfing down cereal while playing games on his phone, completely oblivious to the existential crisis happening one floor above him. Rebecca was notably absent. She worked late shifts at Murphy's and usually slept until noon, which meant I had a few hours to think without her toxic commentary polluting the air. I grabbed a bowl of cereal and sat down across from Dad. He looked up from his paper and gave me the kind of nod that passed for morning conversation in our house. Robert Thompson was a man of few words, especially in the morning, but there was something comforting about his steady presence. "Sleep okay?" he asked, which was practically a soliloquy coming from him. "Yeah, fine," I lied. He went back to his paper, and I found myself really looking at him for the first time in a while. At 45, my father looked older than his years. The grain dust had left permanent lines around his eyes, and his hands were cracked and rough from decades of manual labor. But he wasn't unhappy, exactly. He just was. A man who had found his place in the world and made peace with it. I wondered if that was enough. If settling into a predictable routine, earning a modest living, and never asking for more than what you had was actually a form of wisdom rather than defeat. After breakfast, I walked downtown without any particular destination in mind. Millbrook looked different in the harsh light of morning after Rebecca's reality check. The for-lease signs seemed more prominent, the faded paint on the storefronts more noticeable, the general air of resignation more suffocating. I found myself standing in front of Miller's Electronics, the only computer store in town. Through the dusty window, I could see rows of outdated desktop computers and monitors that looked like they belonged in a museum. Mr. Miller was behind the counter, probably doing exactly what he'd been doing every day for the past 20 years. This was where Rebecca expected me to end up, not necessarily at Miller's, but somewhere just like it. Some small predictable business serving the same small predictable clientele, year after year until I retired or died, whichever came first. The thought made my skin crawl. I kept walking until I reached the public library, a brick building that had been constructed during the Depression and hadn't been updated much since. Inside, Mrs. Patterson, the librarian who'd been there since before I was born, was checking in returned books with the methodical precision of someone who'd performed the same task thousands of times. I made my way to the computer section, where 3 ancient terminals provided the town's primary access to the internet. I logged into my email and started scrolling through the messages from outdoor gear suppliers I'd been corresponding with. Their responses were enthusiastic, professional, full of potential. One email in particular caught my attention. It was from Jake Morrison, the founder of a small camping gear company in Colorado called Summit Essentials. He'd been excited about the subscription box concept and had offered to provide products at cost for the first 3 months if I could prove the concept worked. Marcus, his email read, I love what you're trying to build. The outdoor industry needs more innovative distribution models, especially for reaching customers who don't live near specialty retailers. I started Summit Essentials in my garage 5 years ago, with less money than you're talking about. If you can get this off the ground, I'd be honored to be part of it. I read the email 3 times, each time feeling a little more of Rebecca's poison leave my system. Here was someone who believed in my idea, someone who'd actually succeeded in the industry I wanted to enter. He wasn't some dreamy kid from Ohio. He was a real entrepreneur who'd built a real business. I opened a new browser window and started researching Jake Morrison and Summit Essentials. What I found was inspiring and terrifying in equal measure. He'd started the company after losing his job as a software engineer, using his severance pay and credit cards to fund the initial inventory. The first year had been brutal. 18-hour days, sleeping in his office, living on ramen noodles and coffee. But he'd persevered, and now Summit Essentials was generating over $1 million in annual revenue. The path wasn't easy, but it was possible. Real people were doing it. Young people, people from small towns, people without business degrees or trust funds or family connections. I spent the next 2 hours reading success stories, absorbing every piece of information I could find about e-commerce startups, subscription services, and young entrepreneurs who'd built something from nothing. By the time I left the library, my head was spinning with possibilities, and my notebook was full of new ideas. Walking home, I felt like I was seeing Millbrook through new eyes again. But this time, instead of seeing limitation, I was seeing opportunity. The very isolation that Rebecca saw as a prison could be an advantage. Lower costs, fewer distractions, a chance to focus entirely on building something without the temptations and expenses of a big city. When I got home, Rebecca was in the kitchen making lunch. She looked up when I walked in and I could see her assessing my mood, probably wondering if her speech the night before had done its intended damage. Well, well, she said, opening a can of soup. Someone's looking thoughtful today. Please tell me you've come to your senses about that ridiculous business idea. I poured myself a glass of water and leaned against the counter. Actually, I've been thinking about what you said. She smiled with satisfaction. Good. It's never too late to face reality. You're right about some things, I continued. I don't have business experience. I don't know everything about the outdoor gear market. I probably am naive about how hard it's going to be. Rebecca nodded approvingly. Exactly. So you'll skip the competition? No, I said quietly. I'm still going to enter. Her spoon clattered against her bowl. What? Marcus, we talked about this. I explained. You explained why I might fail, I interrupted. You didn't explain why I shouldn't try. Rebecca stared at me like I'd just announced I was planning to flap my arms and fly to the moon. I told you exactly what's going to happen. You're going to embarrass yourself, waste time and energy, and end up disappointed. Maybe, I said. Or maybe I'll win. Maybe I'll build something amazing. Maybe I'll prove that someone from Millbrook can make it big. Marcus. But even if I fail, I continued, at least I'll know. At least I'll have tried. At least I won't spend the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if I'd had the courage to take a shot. Rebecca slammed her hand on the counter. This isn't courage, Marcus. This is stupidity. This is pride. You'd rather fail spectacularly than succeed modestly. You're probably right about that too, I admitted. But here's the thing, Rebecca. I'd rather fail trying to build something I believe in than succeed at settling for something I don't. She shook her head in disgust. You're going to regret this. When you're 25 and still living at home, still chasing some impossible dream, while everyone else your age has real careers and real relationships, you're going to remember this conversation and realize I was right. Maybe, I said again, but I'm willing to take that risk. What I didn't tell Rebecca was that her attempt to destroy my confidence had actually clarified something important for me. She'd forced me to confront the possibility of failure, to really think about what would happen if my business didn't work out. And I'd realized that the worst-case scenario wasn't actually that bad. If I failed, I'd be exactly where Rebecca expected me to be anyway, working a regular job in Millbrook, living a normal life. I wouldn't be any worse off than if I'd never tried at all. But if I succeeded, even partially, I'd be somewhere completely different. The risk-reward calculation wasn't nearly as scary as Rebecca had made it seem. I was risking a few months of effort and the possibility of public embarrassment in exchange for a chance at building something meaningful. Those seemed like pretty good odds to me. That afternoon, I locked myself in my room and got back to work on my presentation. But this time, I approached it differently. Instead of trying to create the perfect business plan, I focused on telling a story. The story of why this mattered, why it could work, and why I was the person to make it happen. I researched each of the judges, learning about their backgrounds, their businesses, their interests. I prepared answers for every tough question I could think of, including the ones Rebecca had thrown at me. I practiced my presentation until I could deliver it, without notes, with confidence, with passion. I also started taking concrete steps to address my weaknesses. I signed up for a basic accounting course at the community college. I reached out to other young entrepreneurs online, asking for advice and learning from their experiences. I even bought my first real camping gear, a sleeping bag and hiking boots, and spent a weekend at the state park, getting a feel for the products I wanted to sell. Every evening, Rebecca would make some snide comment about my little project, as she'd started calling it. But her words had lost their power to hurt me. I'd already confronted the worst-case scenario and decided I could live with it. Her criticism now felt like background noise, annoying but ultimately irrelevant. The business plan competition was 3 weeks away, and I was ready. Not ready in the sense that I was guaranteed to win, but ready in the sense that I was prepared to give it everything I had. Ready to stand up in front of those judges and make the case for my dream, regardless of what anyone else thought about my chances. Most importantly, I was ready to prove to myself that I wasn't going to be another casualty of small-town resignation. I wasn't going to let fear or cynicism or other people's limitations become my own. Rebecca had tried to convince me that I was stuck in Millbrook forever, just like everyone else. But she was wrong about one crucial thing. I wasn't like everyone else. I wasn't going to accept that this was all there was. I was going to fight for something better, even if it killed me. The kid who'd quit his paper route because getting up early was too hard was gone. In his place was someone harder, more determined, someone who'd learned that the only real failure was not trying at all. I was done listening to people who'd given up on their own dreams. Tell me why I should give up on mine. The morning of the business plan competition arrived with an unseasonably cool breeze that felt like a good omen. I'd been awake since 4 a.m., not because I was nervous, though I definitely was, but because my mind wouldn't stop racing through my presentation one final time. I'd practiced it so many times that I could probably deliver it in my sleep, but there's something about a make-or-break moment that makes you want to rehearse just one more time. I put on the only suit I owned, a navy blue number that Mom had bought me for high school graduation. It was slightly too big in the shoulders and a little short in the legs, but it was clean and pressed, and it would have to do. Looking at myself in the mirror, I tried to see what the judges would see. Not the kid who'd grown up in this house, but a serious entrepreneur with a viable business plan. Downstairs, Mom had made a special breakfast of pancakes and bacon, the kind of meal she usually reserved for birthdays or Christmas morning. Dad was already at the table, dressed in his work clothes but lingering over his coffee instead of rushing off to the grain elevator. "Big day," he said, which qualified as a pep talk coming from Marcus Thompson. "Yeah," I replied, sitting down and trying to calm my stomach enough to eat something. Mom bustled around the kitchen, clearly nervous on my behalf. "I packed you some mints for after lunch," she said, pressing a small tin into my hand. "And I put an extra $20 in your wallet just in case." The gesture was small but meaningful. $20 was a lot of money in our household, especially with Dad's reduced hours. It was her way of saying she believed in me, even if she didn't fully understand what I was trying to do. Rebecca appeared in the doorway, looking like she'd just rolled out of bed. She was scheduled to work the lunch shift at Murphy's, which meant she had time to witness my departure and probably offer some final words of discouragement. "So," she said, leaning against the doorframe with her arms crossed, "today's the big day when my little brother makes a fool of himself in public." "Rebecca," Mom said sharply, "that's enough." "What?" "I'm just being realistic. Better he hears it from me than from those judges." She looked directly at me. "It's not too late to change your mind, Marcus. You could skip this whole thing, and no one would blame you. Tell them you got sick or something." I finished my orange juice and stood up. "Thanks for the concern, but I'll be fine. Will you?" Rebecca pushed off from the doorframe and stepped into the kitchen. "Because once you get up there, and they start asking real questions about cash flow and customer acquisition costs and market penetration, you're going to realize how out of your depth you are." Dad cleared his throat. "Rebecca, your brother's made his decision. Let it be." She turned to look at him, surprised. Dad rarely intervened in our arguments, preferring to let us work things out ourselves. But something in his tone made it clear that this conversation was over. "Fine," Rebecca said, throwing up her hands. "Don't say I didn't warn you." She grabbed her keys and headed for the door. "I'll be at Murphy's when you want to cry about it later." The community college was a 20-minute drive from our house, and Mom insisted on coming with me for moral support. We drove in comfortable silence, both of us lost in our own thoughts. The campus was small and unimpressive, a collection of brick buildings that looked like they'd been designed by someone with no imagination and a very limited budget. The business plan competition was being held in the main auditorium, a sterile room with fluorescent lighting and blue carpet that had seen better days. When we arrived, there were already a dozen other contestants milling around, most of them older than me and all of them looking more professional than I felt. I checked in with the organizers and got my presentation slot, number 7 out of 12, right in the middle, which felt about right. Not so early that the judges would still be warming up, not so late that they'd be tired and ready to go home. The judges were exactly what I'd expected. 5 local business owners who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else on a Saturday morning. There was Margaret Chen, who owned 3 restaurants in the county, David Brooks, who ran the largest accounting firm in the region, Patricia Williams, who'd built a small real estate empire, James Murphy, no relation to Murphy's Bar, who owned a chain of hardware stores, and Dr. Sandra Martinez, who'd founded a successful medical practice and was apparently the token woman on the panel. I found a seat in the back and settled in to watch the other presentations. The first few contestants were exactly what Rebecca had predicted: safe, local business ideas that served obvious community needs. A new daycare center, a pet grooming service, a food truck specializing in comfort food. They were all perfectly reasonable business plans, well-researched and professionally presented. They were also exactly the kind of small-thinking ventures that would keep their owners comfortably trapped in the same 30-mile radius for the rest of their lives. By the time my turn came, I had a pretty good sense of what the judges were looking for. They wanted businesses that made sense, that served clear local needs, that didn't require too much imagination or risk-taking. They wanted the business equivalent of Rebecca's worldview: modest ambitions, predictable outcomes, nothing too scary or unfamiliar, which made what I was about to do either very brave or very stupid. "Our next presenter is Marcus Thompson," announced the moderator. "Marcus is proposing Adventure Gear Monthly, a subscription-based outdoor equipment service." I walked to the front of the room, set up my laptop, and looked out at the audience. There were about 50 people scattered throughout the auditorium, other contestants, family members, and a few curious onlookers. In the back row, I could see my mother giving me an encouraging smile. "Good morning," I began, and my voice was steadier than I'd expected. "My name is Marcus Thompson, and I'm here to talk to you about a revolution in how outdoor enthusiasts discover and purchase gear." I clicked to my first slide, which showed a photograph of a cluttered camping store. If you're serious about outdoor recreation, you know this frustration. You walk into a store looking for something specific, but you're overwhelmed by choices. You don't know which brands are trustworthy, which products are worth the investment, or which new innovations might enhance your next adventure. Click. Next slide. Statistics about the outdoor recreation industry. The outdoor gear market is worth $28 billion annually and growing by 12% each year. But most of that growth is happening online, through specialty retailers that most people have never heard of. There's a massive gap between the people who want quality outdoor gear and the small companies that make it. I could see the judges starting to pay attention. Numbers always got their attention. Adventure Gear Monthly bridges that gap. Every month, our subscribers receive a curated box of outdoor products from emerging brands, products they probably never would have discovered otherwise. We're not just selling gear, we're selling discovery, expertise, and the confidence that comes from knowing you have the right equipment for your next adventure. Click. Revenue projections, customer acquisition strategies, partnership agreements. For the next 10 minutes, I laid out my business plan with the passion and precision I'd been practicing for weeks. I talked about the subscription economy, about the power of curation in an overwhelming marketplace, about the community we'd build around shared outdoor experiences. But most importantly, I talked about vision. I talked about building something that could grow beyond Millbrook, beyond Ohio, beyond the artificial boundaries that seemed to define everyone else's ambitions. When I finished, there was a moment of silence that felt like it lasted forever. Then the questions began. "Marcus," said Margaret Chen, "this is an interesting concept, but how do you plan to compete with established outdoor retailers like REI or Cabela's?" I'd been ready for this one. We're not competing with them directly. We're serving a different need, discovery rather than fulfillment. Our customers aren't people who know exactly what they want. They're people who want to be introduced to products they didn't know existed. "What about inventory management?" asked David Brooks. "How do you plan to handle returns, defective products, seasonal variations in demand?" Another expected question. I walked through my logistics plan, my partnerships with suppliers, my strategy for managing risk. The questions kept coming, each one designed to expose weaknesses in my plan or gaps in my knowledge. But I'd done my homework. For every concern they raised, I had a thoughtful response. For every potential problem they identified, I had a strategy to address it. Finally, Dr. Martinez leaned forward. "Marcus, I have to ask. You're 18 years old, you've never run a business, and you're proposing to enter a highly competitive market with a model that depends on sophisticated logistics and customer service. Why should we believe you can execute this vision?" It was the question I'd been dreading and preparing for in equal measure, the question that got to the heart of Rebecca's criticism and my own deepest doubts. I took a breath and looked directly at her. "Dr. Martinez, you're absolutely right. I don't have experience running a business. I don't have an MBA or a track record of success. What I do have is passion for this market, a deep understanding of my target customers, and the kind of hunger that only comes from having everything to prove and nothing to lose." I paused, gathering my thoughts. More importantly, I have the advantage of thinking differently. I'm not limited by how things have always been done. I'm not afraid to challenge assumptions or try new approaches. Sometimes the best person to disrupt an industry is someone who isn't already invested in the status quo. When the Q&A session ended, I packed up my laptop and returned to my seat, my heart pounding with adrenaline. I'd given it everything I had. Whether it was enough remained to be seen. Waited. The remaining presentations blurred together in my mind. I was too wired to focus on anything except the knowledge that in about an hour, I'd know whether my dreams were about to become reality or crash into the wall of small-town pragmatism. When the judges returned from their deliberation, the tension in the room was palpable. The moderator stepped up to the microphone, holding an envelope that contained my immediate future. "This year's competition featured 12 excellent business plans," he began, each addressing important community needs and demonstrating the entrepreneurial spirit that makes our region strong. Get on with it, I thought. The judges were particularly impressed by the quality of research and the level of preparation demonstrated by all our contestants. However, one presentation stood out for its innovation, its potential for growth, and its creator's obvious passion for the business. My mouth went dry. This year's winner, receiving $10,000 in startup funding and ongoing mentorship from our panel of judges, is... The pause felt eternal. Marcus Thompson in Adventure Gear Monthly. The applause that followed sounded like it was coming from underwater. I felt my mother's hand squeeze my shoulder, heard my name being called to come forward, but I was moving through a dream. This couldn't be real. Kids from Millbrook didn't win business plan competitions. Kids from Millbrook didn't get $10,000 to start revolutionary companies. But apparently, this one just had mms. As I shook hands with each judge and posed for photos with an oversized check, one thought kept running through my mind. Rebecca was wrong. She was wrong about me, wrong about the limits of ambition, wrong about the impossibility of escape. I wasn't stuck in Millbrook forever. I was just getting started. 2 weeks later, I was sitting in Jake Morrison's office in Denver, Colorado, signing a partnership agreement that would make Summit Essentials the exclusive gear provider for Adventure Gear Monthly's launch. The $10,000 from the competition had been enough to convince him I was serious, and his enthusiasm had convinced me that this partnership could be the foundation for something much bigger than either of us had imagined. "You know," Jake said as we finished the paperwork, "when I first started Summit Essentials, people told me I was crazy. They said the outdoor gear market was too crowded, too competitive, too hard to break into." "What did you do?" I asked. He grinned. "I proved them wrong. Just like you're about to do." That night, I called home from my hotel room in Denver. Mom answered on the second ring, and I could hear the excitement in her voice when she realized it was me. "How's Colorado, honey? How did the meeting go?" "It went great, Mom. Better than great. I think this is really going to work." We talked for a few minutes about the partnership, about my plans for the next few months, about how strange it felt to be so far from home. Then she put Dad on the phone. "Proud of you, son," he said. And those 4 words meant more to me than any business contract I'd ever sign. Finally, inevitably, Rebecca got on the line. "So," she said, her voice carefully neutral, "I hear you're living it up in the big city." "It's just a business trip, Rebecca. I'll be back next week to get everything set up." "Will you?" There was something different in her tone, less hostile than usual. "Or are you going to decide that Millbrook isn't good enough for the big-shot entrepreneur?" I thought about that for a moment. The truth was, I probably would leave Millbrook eventually. Not because I was too good for it, but because my business would require me to be where my customers and partners were. But that wasn't something I was ready to discuss with Rebecca. "I'm coming home," I said simply. "We'll see what happens after that." There was a long pause. Then, quietly, she said, "I'm sorry, Marcus." "For what?" "For trying to talk you out of it. For saying you'd never make it. For being—" She struggled with the words. "For being afraid that if you succeeded, it would prove I gave up too easily." It was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever heard from Rebecca, and it caught me completely off guard. "You didn't give up," I said. "You made different choices." "There's nothing wrong with that." "Maybe," she said. "But there was something wrong with trying to make you make the same choices." After we hung up, I stood at the window of my hotel room, looking out at the lights of Denver stretching toward the mountains. Somewhere out there were customers I hadn't met yet, products I hadn't discovered yet, opportunities I hadn't even imagined yet. Rebecca had been wrong about a lot of things, but she'd been right about one. I wasn't going to stay in Millbrook forever. I was going to leave. And I was going to build something bigger than anyone in that small town could imagine. But I wasn't leaving as the failure she'd predicted. I was leaving as someone who'd proven that dreams backed by determination could overcome any limitation, any discouragement, any small-town cynicism. I was leaving as someone who'd already won. The first year of Adventure Gear Monthly nearly killed me, but not in the way Rebecca had predicted. She'd warned me about the crushing disappointment of failure, but she'd never mentioned the crushing exhaustion of success. Within 6 months of launching, we had 2,000 subscribers. Within a year, that number had grown to 8,500. The problem wasn't that customers didn't want what we were selling. The problem was that they wanted it faster than I could deliver it. I'd started the business in my parents' basement, which had seemed like a romantic entrepreneurial gesture, until I was processing 200 orders a day in a space designed for storing Christmas decorations and Dad's old fishing gear. The basement quickly transformed into a logistical nightmare of cardboard boxes, packing materials and inventory that threatened to bury our family alive. "Marcus," Mom called down the stairs one morning, "Mrs. Henderson is here, and she wants to know why there are UPS trucks outside our house every day." Mrs. Henderson was our next-door neighbor, a woman who viewed any deviation from suburban normalcy as a personal affront. The daily parade of delivery trucks bringing inventory and picking up orders had apparently pushed her over the edge. I climbed the stairs, my back aching from hours of hunching over boxes, to find Mrs. Henderson standing in our living room with her arms crossed and her lips pursed in disapproval. "Marcus Thompson," she said, "are you running some kind of illegal operation out of this house?" "It's a legitimate business, Mrs. Henderson. I have all the proper licenses and permits." "Well, it's disrupting the entire neighborhood. The noise, the traffic, the constant commotion. This is a residential area, not an industrial zone." She wasn't wrong. What had started as a modest home-based business had evolved into something that was clearly outgrowing its space. I was working 18-hour days, 7 days a week, and I was still falling behind on orders. The success that I dreamed of was threatening to become a nightmare of its own making. That evening, I sat down with my parents to discuss the inevitable. I needed to move the business out of their house. "We're not trying to get rid of you," Mom said quickly. "But Mrs. Henderson has a point. This isn't sustainable." Dad nodded. "Son, you've built something impressive here, but it's time for the next step." The next step turned out to be a 5,000-square-foot warehouse on the outskirts of Columbus, about an hour's drive from Millbrook. It was a huge leap. The rent alone was more than my parents' mortgage payment, but the business was generating enough revenue to justify the expense. More importantly, it allowed me to hire my first employees. Sarah Chen, Margaret Chen's daughter, became my operations manager. She'd graduated from Ohio State with a business degree and had been working at a logistics company in Columbus, but she was excited about the opportunity to be part of a growing startup. Then there was Mike Rodriguez, a former Army logistics specialist who understood warehouse management better than anyone I'd ever met. He could organize inventory with military precision and had a gift for streamlining processes that saved us thousands of dollars in operational costs. The third hire was the most important. Jessica Martinez, a marketing genius who'd been working for a digital agency in Cleveland. She understood social media, email marketing, and customer acquisition in ways that made my head spin. More importantly, she believed in the vision of Adventure Gear Monthly as more than just a subscription service. She saw it as a community, a lifestyle brand, a way to connect outdoor enthusiasts with the gear and experiences that would enhance their adventures. By the end of year 2, we had 25,000 subscribers and a team of 12 employees. The basement operation had evolved into a real company with real systems, real processes, and real growth potential, but success came with unexpected challenges. The outdoor gear industry was more competitive than I'd anticipated, and several established companies were starting to launch their own subscription services. REI introduced REI Co-op Experiences, a quarterly box that leveraged their massive buying power and brand recognition. Patagonia launched Wild Quarterly, focusing on environmental activism and sustainable gear. These weren't small startups trying to compete with us. These were industry giants with resources we couldn't match. They had marketing budgets larger than our entire annual revenue. They had relationships with suppliers that went back decades. They had retail stores where customers could touch and feel products before committing to a subscription. "We're David fighting Goliath," Jessica said during one of our weekly strategy meetings, "except Goliath has a marketing department and a century of brand loyalty." It was Jake Morrison who suggested the pivot that would change everything. During one of our quarterly check-ins, he mentioned something that had been bothering him about the subscription box model. "The problem with subscription boxes," he said, "is that they're passive. Customers get a box, they use the gear, and that's it. There's no ongoing relationship, no community, no deeper engagement with the brand." "What are you suggesting?" I asked. "What if Adventure Gear Monthly wasn't just a product company? What if it was an experience company?" The idea that emerged from that conversation was ambitious and terrifying. Adventure Gear Monthly would evolve into a full-service outdoor adventure company. We'd still curate gear, but we'd also organize trips, provide training, create educational content, and build a community of outdoor enthusiasts who saw us as their trusted guide to everything related to outdoor recreation. Instead of competing with REI and Patagonia on their terms, we'd create an entirely new category. We'd be the company that didn't just sell you gear. We'd be the company that taught you how to use it, connected you with other people who shared your interests, and created experiences that made those products meaningful. The pivot required a complete restructuring of the business. We hired adventure guides, wilderness safety instructors, and content creators. We partnered with national parks, state forests, and private adventure companies to offer exclusive experiences to our subscribers. We launched Adventure Gear Academy, an online platform that provided training videos, safety courses, and skill-building workshops. We created Gear Connect, a social platform where subscribers could share photos from their adventures, ask questions about equipment, and organize group trips. Most importantly, we started organizing adventure gear expeditions, monthly trips to destinations across the country where subscribers could test gear in real-world conditions while learning from expert guides. The transformation wasn't easy. We burned through our cash reserves, maxed out our credit lines, and worked 100-hour weeks for months. There were times when I questioned whether we'd made a terrible mistake, whether we should have stuck with the simple subscription box model that was working. But by the end of year 3, the numbers told a different story. We had 50,000 subscribers paying an average of $89 per month, plus additional revenue from expeditions, academy courses, and premium gear partnerships. Our annual revenue had crossed the $50 million mark, and we were profitable for the first time since the pivot. More importantly, we'd created something unique in the outdoor industry. Adventure Gear Monthly wasn't just a company. It was a movement, a community, a lifestyle brand that stood for something bigger than profit margins and quarterly earnings. The media attention started small. A mention in Outside Magazine, a feature in Entrepreneur, a spot on a local morning show. But as our story spread, so did our reputation. We were the scrappy startup that had taken on industry giants and won. We were the company that had redefined what it meant to serve outdoor enthusiasts. Forbes named me to their 30 under 30 inches list. Inc. magazine featured Adventure Gear Monthly as one of the fastest-growing companies in America. TechCrunch wrote about our innovative use of community building and experiential marketing. The recognition was gratifying, but what meant more was the feedback from our customers. The emails from people who'd discovered new passions through our expeditions. The photos from families who'd bonded over adventures we'd helped facilitate. The stories from individuals who'd gained confidence, made friends, and discovered parts of themselves they never knew existed. We weren't just selling gear anymore. We were selling transformation. By year 4, we'd outgrown the Columbus warehouse and moved operations to a custom-built facility in Denver, closer to our adventure partners and the heart of the outdoor industry. The move made sense from a business perspective, but it also represented something more symbolic. I was no longer tethered to Ohio, no longer limited by the geographical boundaries of my childhood. The Denver headquarters was everything I dreamed of when I was 18, and sketching business plans in my bedroom. Open floor plans, standing desks, a climbing wall in the break room, and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out at the Rocky Mountains. It was the kind of workspace that attracted top talent from across the country, people who wanted to be part of something innovative and meaningful. But success also brought unexpected pressures. Venture capital firms started calling, offering massive investments in exchange for equity stakes. Outdoor industry giants inquired about acquisition opportunities. Headhunters tried to poach our key employees with offers that would have sounded impossible just a few years earlier. The most persistent suitor was Cascade Outdoor Group, a conglomerate that owned several major outdoor brands. Their CEO, Richard Blackstone, had been pursuing us for months with increasingly aggressive offers. "Marcus," he said during our latest meeting, "you've built something impressive, but you're still thinking small. Cascade has the resources to take Adventure Gear Monthly global. We're talking about operations in Europe, Asia, Australia. We're talking about scaling beyond anything you could achieve independently." His final offer was $280 million for a complete acquisition. It was the kind of money that would have made me one of the wealthiest people in Ohio, the kind of success that no one, especially not Rebecca, could have imagined when I was 18 and desperate to prove myself. But something about the offer felt wrong. Cascade was exactly the kind of corporate giant that Adventure Gear Monthly had been built to compete against. They thought in terms of market share and profit margins, not community building and authentic experiences. I appreciate the offer, I told Blackstone, but Adventure Gear Monthly isn't for sale. Everything's for sale at the right price, he replied. What would it take? It's not about price, it's about vision. You see a profitable business to absorb into your portfolio. I see a mission that's just getting started. The conversation ended cordially, but I knew it wasn't over. Companies like Cascade didn't give up easily, especially when they wanted something as badly as they wanted us. That night, I called my parents from my apartment in Denver. It had become a weekly ritual, a way to stay connected to the people who'd supported me from the beginning. "How's business?" Dad asked, which was his way of asking about everything. My health, my happiness, my plans for the future. "Good," I said. "Really good. We just had our best quarter ever." "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Mom chimed in from the extension. "Are you taking care of yourself? Eating enough? Getting enough sleep?" I laughed. "I'm fine, Mom. Better than fine." There was a pause, then Rebecca's voice joined the conversation. She'd moved back in with our parents after breaking up with her boyfriend, and she'd been working as the evening manager at a new restaurant in town. "Marcus," she said, and there was something different in her tone, pride mixed with something that might have been regret. "I saw the article about you in Business Week. Mom has it framed in the kitchen." "Rebecca, no, let me say this. I was wrong. About everything. About your chances, about your dreams, about what was possible for someone from Millbrook." She paused. "I'm proud of you, and I'm sorry it took me so long to say it." It was the conversation I'd been waiting 5 years to have, but it didn't feel as satisfying as I'd expected. Rebecca's approval mattered less now than it had when I was 18 and desperate for validation. "Thanks," I said simply. "That means a lot." "So what's next?" she asked. "You've conquered the outdoor gear world, you're rich and famous, you're living in Colorado with mountain views. What else could you possibly want?" It was a good question, one I'd been asking myself lately. Adventure Gear Monthly was successful beyond my wildest teenage dreams, but success had brought its own questions about purpose and direction. "I don't know," I admitted. "I'm still figuring that out," but even as I said it, I knew it wasn't entirely true. There was something I wanted, something that had been growing in the back of my mind for months. I wanted to go home, not to stay, but to prove something, to myself, to Rebecca, to everyone who'd ever thought that kids from Millbrook were destined for small lives and smaller dreams. I wanted to show them what was possible when you refused to accept limitations, when you built something bigger than the boundaries other people tried to impose on you. I wanted to buy half the town. The idea to return to Millbrook didn't come to me in a flash of inspiration or revenge fantasy. It grew slowly, like a seed that had been planted years earlier and was finally ready to sprout. The catalyst came during a conversation with my real estate advisor, Patricia Kovac, who specialized in helping successful entrepreneurs diversify their investments. "Marcus," she said during one of our quarterly reviews, "you've done an excellent job building Adventure Gear Monthly, but nearly all your wealth is tied up in the company. You need to start thinking about real estate investments, particularly in emerging markets where you can get in early." "What kind of markets are you thinking about?" I asked. "Small towns with growth potential. Places that are close enough to major cities to benefit from expansion but still affordable enough to generate serious returns. Think about communities that are ripe for revitalization. Maybe somewhere you understand the local dynamics." That's when Millbrook popped into my head. Not as a sentimental journey back to my roots, but as a legitimate investment opportunity that no one else was paying attention to. I started researching my hometown with the same analytical approach I'd used to build my business. What I discovered was fascinating and depressing in equal measure. Millbrook was dying, but it was dying slowly and predictably, which meant there were opportunities for someone with vision and capital. The steel mill closure had created a domino effect that had been playing out for over a decade. Young people left for college and never came back. Local businesses struggled and eventually closed. Property values stagnated, then declined. The town's population had dropped from 8,247 when I was in high school to just under 7,200. But Millbrook had advantages that weren't immediately obvious. It was only 45 minutes from Columbus, which was experiencing rapid growth in the tech and healthcare sectors. The downtown historic district was architecturally intact, unlike many Rust Belt towns that had demolished their commercial cores in failed urban renewal projects. The surrounding farmland was some of the most fertile in Ohio, and there were early signs that agricultural tourism was gaining traction in the region. Most importantly, property was absurdly cheap. Commercial buildings that would cost millions in Columbus were selling for tens of thousands in Millbrook. Residential properties were going for less than the cost of a luxury car. I spent 3 weeks analyzing every aspect of Millbrook's economy, demographics, and growth potential. I studied traffic patterns, zoning regulations, tax incentives, and development opportunities. I researched similar towns that had successfully reinvented themselves and identified the factors that had made their transformations possible. What emerged was a comprehensive revitalization strategy that could transform Millbrook from a dying industrial town into a thriving bedroom community with a vibrant downtown core. It would require patience, significant capital investment, and careful coordination with local government. But it was absolutely doable. The plan had 3 phases. Phase 1 involved acquiring key commercial properties in the downtown core at current depressed prices. Phase 2 focused on attracting new businesses and residents through strategic improvements and incentives. Phase 3 was long-term development of mixed-use projects that would establish Millbrook as a desirable place to live for Columbus commuters. The total investment would be substantial, probably $15 minus $20 million over 5 years. But the potential returns were extraordinary, both financially and personally. I called my parents to let them know I'd be coming home for a visit. "Just a visit?" Mom asked, and I could hear the hope in her voice. "We'll see," I said. "I have some business to look into." The drive from Columbus to Millbrook felt like traveling backward through time. The 4-lane highway gave way to 2-lane country roads, the suburban sprawl faded into farmland, and the billboards advertising corporate chains were replaced by hand-painted signs for local businesses that probably hadn't updated their marketing since the 1980s. When I pulled into downtown Millbrook in my Tesla Model S, I felt like I had landed in a different world. The contrast between my life in Denver and the reality of my hometown was jarring. Streets that had seemed normal when I was 18 now looked shabby and neglected. Buildings that I remembered as simply older now looked genuinely dilapidated. But I was seeing it through different eyes now, not as a place to escape from, but as a canvas for transformation. I parked in front of what used to be Morrison's 5 and Dime, a corner building that had been empty for 3 years. The for sale sign in the window was sun-faded and crooked, suggesting that no one had expressed serious interest in quite some time. I called the number on the sign. "Hartwell Real Estate, this is Janet speaking." "Hi, I'm calling about the Morrison building on Main Street. Is it still available?" "Oh my goodness, yes! Are you actually interested? That poor building has been sitting there forever." "I'd like to schedule a showing. Would this afternoon work?" Janet Hartwell turned out to be a woman in her 60s who'd been selling real estate in Millbrook for 30 years. She was clearly excited to have a potential buyer, but she was also honest about the challenges. "Now, I have to tell you," she said as she unlocked the front door, "this place needs work. The previous owner didn't maintain it very well, and it's been empty for a while. The interior was worse than I'd expected. Water damage had stained the ceiling tiles, the hardwood floors were warped and scratched, and there was a persistent smell of mildew that suggested moisture problems. But the bones of the building were solid: high ceilings, large windows, good natural light, and a layout that could work for retail, office space, or restaurant use." "What are they asking?" I said. $85,000, but I think they'd take less. The owner lives in Florida now and just wants to get rid of it." $85,000. In Denver, that wouldn't buy a parking space. In Millbrook, it could buy a 4,000 square foot commercial building in the heart of downtown. "I'll take it," I said. Janet stared at me. "Don't you want to think about it? Get an inspection? Negotiate on price?" "I'll pay the asking price. Cash? With a 30-day closing." "Can you handle that?" She fumbled for her phone. "I need to call the owner. This is unusual." Over the next 2 hours, I made offers on 6 more properties. The old movie theater, 2 adjacent storefronts that had housed a bookstore and a gift shop, a small office building that had been the town's insurance and real estate hub, and 2 residential properties that could be converted to mixed-use developments. By the time I finished my property tour, word had spread through Millbrook's tiny business community that someone with serious money was buying up downtown real estate. My phone was buzzing with calls from property owners who wanted to know if I was interested in their buildings too. That evening, I had dinner with my parents. The conversation was carefully neutral. They were clearly curious about my sudden interest in Millbrook real estate, but they were trying not to pry. "So," Dad said over Mom's pot roast, "Janet Hartwell called. She said you bought the Morrison building." "That's right. Mind if I ask why?" I'd been thinking about how to explain this to them. The full truth, that I was planning to systematically acquire and redevelop downtown Millbrook as both an investment strategy and a personal statement, seemed like it might be overwhelming. "I think Millbrook has potential," I said simply. "It's close to Columbus, the downtown has good bones, and property prices are low. It seems like a good investment opportunity." Mom smiled. "It would be wonderful to see those old buildings fixed up. The downtown used to be so vibrant when you were little." Rebecca arrived halfway through dinner, having finished her shift at the restaurant. She looked tired but not unhappy. Apparently, her new job was going better than her previous stint at Murphy's Bar. Well, she said, sitting down and helping herself to pot roast. "Look who's back. I heard you're buying up Main Street." "Just a few buildings," I said. "Just a few buildings," she repeated with a slight smile. Marcus Thompson, small-town real estate mogul. Who would have thought? There was no malice in her comment, just genuine amusement. The old Rebecca would have found some way to turn my investment into evidence of failure or foolishness. This version seemed genuinely interested in what I was trying to accomplish. "What are you planning to do with them?" she asked. "Fix them up, find tenants, try to bring some life back to downtown." "And you think that's possible? Bringing life back to Millbrook?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself. "I think it's worth trying. Worst case, I lose some money. Best case, I help turn around a community that deserves better than slow decay." Rebecca nodded thoughtfully. "You know, when you left for Denver, I thought you were running away from this place. I thought you were too good for small-town life." "I wasn't running away," I said. "I was running towards something. There's a difference. I'm starting to understand that." Over the next month, I spent 3 days a week in Millbrook, overseeing property acquisitions and meeting with contractors, architects, and city officials. The mayor, Tom Patterson, was initially suspicious of my intentions. Small towns had been burned before by outside investors who promised revitalization and delivered gentrification or abandonment. But as I laid out my plans and demonstrated my commitment to working with the existing community rather than displacing it, he became an enthusiastic ally. "Marcus," he said during one of our meetings, "I have to admit, when I heard Robert Thompson's boy was buying up downtown, I figured you were planning to flip the properties and disappear. But you're talking about a 10-year commitment, about bringing jobs and residents back to Millbrook. That's exactly what we need." The renovation of the Morrison building became my proof of concept project. Instead of doing a quick cosmetic flip, I invested in a complete restoration that honored the building's historic character while adding modern amenities. New electrical and plumbing systems, restored hardwood floors, updated windows that maintained the original aesthetic, and a completely rebuilt HVAC system. The project took 4 months and cost 3 times what I'd paid for the building. But when it was finished, the Morrison building was a showcase of what was possible when you combined respect for history with modern functionality. The first tenant was Sarah Chen, who'd left her job at Adventure Gear Monthly to open a combination coffee shop and bookstore. "Marcus," she said, "if you're serious about revitalizing Millbrook, you need businesses that give people a reason to spend time downtown. Coffee and books are a good start." Within 6 months, I'd acquired 14 properties and started renovation work on 8 of them. The movie theater was being converted into a community arts center with a small performance space and artist studios. The old insurance building was becoming a co-working space for freelancers and remote workers. 2 of the residential properties were being converted into mixed-use developments with street-level retail and upper-floor apartments. The changes were subtle but visible. The for sale and for lease signs were disappearing. Construction crews were working on multiple buildings simultaneously. New businesses were starting to inquire about space in the renovated properties. More importantly, people were starting to talk about Millbrook's future instead of just its past. The local newspaper, which had been reduced to a weekly publication that was more obituaries than news, suddenly had stories to tell about development projects, new businesses, and rising property values. Rebecca had been watching the transformation with a mixture of amazement and something that might have been pride. "You know," she said one evening as we walked down Main Street, "when you told me you'd never accept limitations, I thought you were just being stubborn. I didn't realize you were being prophetic." "I wasn't being prophetic," I said. "I was being determined." She stopped walking and turned to face me. "Marcus, I owe you an apology, a real one, not the half-hearted thing I said on the phone a few years ago." "Rebecca, no, let me say this. When we were kids, I was jealous of your dreams because I didn't have the courage to pursue my own. I tried to convince you that limitations were real because I'd convinced myself that mine were. I wanted you to fail because your success would prove that I'd given up too easily." She looked around at the buildings I'd been renovating, at the signs of life returning to a downtown that had been dying for 20 years. "But you didn't fail. You did exactly what you said you'd do. You left this town, you built something amazing, and now you're coming back to lift the whole place up with you." "I'm not trying to be anyone's savior," I said. "I'm just trying to build something meaningful." "That's exactly what makes it meaningful," she replied. As we continued walking, I realized that Rebecca was right about one thing. I had come back to prove something. Not to her specifically, but to everyone who'd ever believed that geography was destiny, that economic circumstances were insurmountable, that dreams were luxuries that small-town kids couldn't afford. I was proving that with enough determination, enough capital, and enough vision, you could transform not just your own life but the lives of an entire community. But the most important thing I was proving was something I'd learned years earlier, sitting in my childhood bedroom with a business plan and a dream. The only limitations that really matter are the ones you accept for yourself. 2 years into the Millbrook revitalization project, something unexpected happened. People started moving back home. It began with Lisa Martinez, Joe Martinez's daughter, who'd graduated from Ohio State with a degree in graphic design and had been working for an advertising agency in Cleveland. When she heard about the co-working space I'd created in the renovated insurance building, she decided to give freelancing a try from her hometown. "The rent is a third of what I was paying in Cleveland," she told me over coffee at Sarah's bookstore cafe. "I can walk to work. My parents are 5 minutes away, and honestly, the quality of life is better here. I forgot how quiet it gets at night, how you can actually see stars." Lisa became the first tenant in Millbrook Collaborative, the co-working space that had become the unofficial headquarters of the town's small but growing community of remote workers, freelancers, and small business owners. Within 6 months, all 12 desk spaces were occupied, and I was getting inquiries about expanding. The second major breakthrough came when Dr. Amanda Walsh, a family physician who'd grown up in Millbrook, decided to open a practice in one of the renovated storefronts. She'd been working at a large clinic in Columbus, but the commute was killing her, and she'd always dreamed of serving the community where she'd grown up. "Rural communities are losing healthcare access everywhere," she explained during our lease negotiation. "Young doctors graduate with massive student loans and feel like they have to work in high-paying urban practices. But there's something to be said for being the doctor who delivered half your patients, who knows their families, who's invested in their long-term health rather than just their quarterly numbers." Dr. Walsh's practice became an anchor tenant that attracted other businesses. A pharmacy opened next door, then a physical therapy clinic, then a small, urgent care center. Suddenly, downtown Millbrook had a healthcare cluster that served not just our town, but several surrounding communities. The momentum was building faster than I'd anticipated. Property values started rising. Not dramatically, but steadily. Young families began moving to Millbrook because they could buy a beautiful historic home for the price of a down payment on a starter home in Columbus. But the real transformation wasn't just economic, it was cultural. For the first time in decades, Millbrook felt like a community with a future rather than just a past. The arts center I'd created in the old movie theater was hosting monthly performances, art shows, and community events. The first Friday art walks that local business owners had organized were drawing visitors from neighboring towns. The farmers' market that had been struggling to attract vendors suddenly had a waiting list. Most surprisingly, Adventure Gear Monthly had become an unexpected economic driver for the town. When I decided to open a satellite office in Millbrook, I'd expected it to be a symbolic gesture, a way to maintain my connection to home while keeping the real operations in Denver. But rural Ohio turned out to be an ideal location for certain aspects of our business. Customer service representatives didn't need to be in a major city, and they could provide better service when they weren't dealing with big city distractions and turnover. Our fulfillment operations could benefit from lower real estate costs and a workforce that valued stability over constant job hopping. Within 18 months, Adventure Gear Monthly's Millbrook operations employed 43 people, making it the largest private employer in town. More importantly, these weren't minimum wage jobs. They were positions with benefits, growth opportunities, and salaries that could support families in a community where the cost of living was reasonable. The ripple effects were everywhere. The elementary school, which had been facing closure due to declining enrollment, suddenly needed to hire additional teachers. The grocery store expanded and updated its produce section to serve the growing population of health-conscious outdoor enthusiasts. A new restaurant opened, specializing in farm-to-table cuisine that attracted diners from across the county. Even Murphy's Bar, Rebecca's old workplace, underwent a transformation. The new owner, a young entrepreneur named Kevin Murphy, grandson of the original owner, had converted half the space into a gastropub that served craft beer and elevated comfort food, while maintaining the working-class atmosphere that had always defined the establishment. But the most significant change was psychological. Millbrook's residents were starting to believe in their town's future again. They were investing in home improvements, starting new businesses, and encouraging their adult children to consider moving back. The narrative of inevitable decline had been replaced by one of cautious optimism and genuine possibility. Rebecca had a front-row seat to these changes as the evening manager at the Millbrook Table, the farm-to-table restaurant that had opened in one of my renovated buildings. She'd been skeptical when I'd first approached her about the position, convinced that a fancy restaurant wouldn't survive in a town where most people considered Applebee's exotic cuisine. "Marcus," she'd said, "you're asking me to manage a place that serves $20 entrees to people who clip coupons for McDonald's. This is going to be a disaster." But she'd been wrong about that, just as she'd been wrong about so many other things. The Millbrook Table was booked solid most weekends, attracting customers from Columbus, Dayton, and even Cincinnati, who made the drive specifically to experience what food critics were calling, quote, authentic Midwest farm cuisine in an unexpectedly sophisticated setting. More importantly, Rebecca had discovered that she was exceptionally good at restaurant management. She understood customer service, knew how to manage staff, and had an intuitive grasp of the hospitality industry that couldn't be taught in business school. "I think I might actually be good at this," she told me one evening as we closed up the restaurant together. "I mean, really good. Like, maybe I should have been doing this all along instead of wasting my 20s pouring drinks for drunk farmers." "You weren't wasting your 20s, I said. You were learning skills you didn't know you were learning. Customer service, conflict resolution, managing difficult people under pressure. All of that translates to restaurant management." She paused in wiping down tables and looked at me. "You really believe that? That the time I spent at Murphy's wasn't just lost time?" "I believe that every experience teaches you something, even if you don't realize it at the time. Especially the experiences that challenge you or push you out of your comfort zone." Rebecca had changed over the past 2 years, but so had I. The angry, defensive young man who'd left Millbrook with something to prove had evolved into someone who was more interested in building things up than tearing them down. Success had given me perspective, but so had the process of returning home and seeing my family and community through adult eyes. The major test of everything we'd accomplished came during the summer of our 3rd year, when Millbrook hosted its first annual Harvest Festival, a weekend-long celebration that combined the traditional corn festival that had been struggling for years with new elements designed to showcase the town's revitalization. The festival featured local vendors, live music, art displays, farm tours, and outdoor adventure demonstrations, coordinated by Adventure Gear Monthly. We expected maybe a few hundred visitors from neighboring towns. Instead, we got over 3,000 people from across Ohio and several surrounding states. The local newspaper called it the most successful community event in Millbrook's modern history. The State Tourism Board featured it in their promotional materials. And most importantly, it proved that Millbrook could compete for tourist dollars with more established destinations. But the festival also revealed some uncomfortable truths about the changes we'd created. Property values were rising faster than longtime residents could afford. Young professionals moving to Millbrook were pricing out some of the families who'd stuck with the community through its darkest years. The new businesses served the tastes and budgets of newcomers rather than longtime residents. The tension came to a head during a heated town council meeting in October, when Mrs. Patterson, the librarian who'd been there since before I was born, stood up to voice concerns that had been simmering for months. "I'm happy that Millbrook is growing," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I'm grateful to Marcus Thompson and everyone else who's invested in our community. But I'm also worried that we're losing the things that made this place special in the first place." She looked directly at me. "My property taxes have doubled in 3 years. The new restaurant is beautiful, but I can't afford to eat there. The co-working space is full of young people with laptops. But where are the machinist shops and the tool and die companies that used to employ half this town?" Her words hit harder than Rebecca's had all those years ago, because they came from a place of genuine concern rather than cynicism. Mrs. Patterson wasn't trying to tear down what we'd built. She was trying to make sure that progress didn't come at the expense of the people who'd kept Millbrook alive during its darkest years. "You raise important points," I said when the floor was open for responses. "And you're right that development without consideration for existing residents isn't real revitalization. It's just gentrification with better marketing." I'd been thinking about these issues for months, knowing that they were inevitable consequences of successful redevelopment. The challenge was figuring out how to manage growth in a way that benefited everyone, not just newcomers and property owners. "I'd like to propose the creation of a community advisory board," I continued, "made up of longtime residents, new residents, business owners, and community leaders. This board would review all major development proposals and ensure that they serve the interests of the entire community, not just investors." It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. More importantly, it acknowledged that successful community development required input from the community itself, not just the people with capital to invest. The meeting ended with the formation of a task force to explore Mrs. Patterson's concerns and develop policies that would preserve Millbrook's character while accommodating growth. Rebecca volunteered to serve on the task force, as did several other longtime residents and business owners. Walking home that night, I realized that the challenge of balancing progress with preservation was actually a sign of success. 5 years earlier, Millbrook's biggest problem had been decline and abandonment. Now its biggest problem was managing growth and opportunity. "You know," Rebecca said as we walked down Main Street, past the glowing windows of businesses that hadn't existed 3 years earlier, "this is probably the first time in Millbrook's history that our biggest worry is having too much good stuff happening." She was right. The town that had once seemed trapped in a cycle of decline was now grappling with the challenges of prosperity. Property values were rising, new businesses were opening, young families were moving back, and the population was growing for the first time in 30 years. But the most significant transformation wasn't economic. It was psychological. Millbrook's residents no longer saw themselves as victims of forces beyond their control. They saw themselves as active participants in shaping their community's future. The kid who'd been told he'd never leave this town hadn't just left. He'd come back and helped create a version of the town that people actually wanted to stay in. And in doing so, he'd proven that limitations aren't permanent fixtures. They're temporary obstacles that can be overcome with enough vision, determination, and willingness to do the work. The question now wasn't whether Marcus Thompson would ever leave Millbrook again. The question was what he'd build next, and how many other people he'd inspire to believe that their own limitations were more negotiable than they'd ever imagined. 5 years after I'd started buying properties in Millbrook, I was standing in the conference room of the newly renovated City Hall, signing the papers that would make me the official owner of 53 commercial and residential properties throughout the downtown core. It represented roughly 40% of all commercial real estate in Millbrook, not quite half the town, but close enough to make the point. The final property acquisition was symbolic, rather than strategic. The Henderson family had decided to sell their century-old hardware store building, the same store where Mrs. Henderson had once complained about the UPS trucks disrupting her quiet neighborhood. Mr. Henderson had passed away the previous winter, and his children, who'd all moved away decades ago, wanted to liquidate their inheritance rather than deal with property management from distant cities. "Mr. Thompson," said Janet Hartwell, who'd handled nearly every one of my property transactions over the years, "I have to say, when you bought that first building 5 years ago, I never imagined it would lead to this." She gestured toward the stack of deeds and contracts that represented the largest real estate portfolio in Millbrook's history. "You've essentially rebuilt this town from the ground up." As I signed the final documents, I couldn't help but think about the 18-year-old kid who'd once stood in this same building, applying for the business license that would allow him to participate in a community college competition. That kid had been desperate to prove he could escape Millbrook. This version of me had chosen to return and transform it instead. The celebration that evening was held at the Millbrook table, the restaurant where Rebecca had discovered her calling as a hospitality professional. She'd actually bought the business 6 months earlier, using a combination of her savings, a small business loan, and a minority investment from me that gave her full operational control while providing me with a modest return. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rebecca announced to the crowd of about 60 people, city officials, business owners, longtime residents, and newer arrivals who'd been drawn to Millbrook's renaissance, "I'd like to propose a toast to my brother Marcus, who proved that sometimes the best way to leave a place is to come back and make it worth staying in." The applause was warm and genuine, but what struck me most was the composition of the crowd. 5 years ago, a celebration like this would have been impossible, because there hadn't been enough successful local businesses to fill a room. Now we had doctors, lawyers, entrepreneurs, artists, farmers, teachers, and skilled tradespeople all mingling together in a space that represented everything we'd accomplished. Dr. Walsh was there with her husband and 2 young children, who'd moved to Millbrook from Columbus specifically because they wanted to raise their kids in a small town with good schools and community values. Lisa Martinez was there with her new boyfriend, a software developer who'd started working remotely from Millbrook after discovering he could rent a 3-bedroom house for less than his studio apartment in Cleveland had cost. Kevin Murphy was there, representing the 3rd generation of his family to run Murphy's Bar, which had become a cornerstone of the revitalized downtown district. Mrs. Patterson was there too, now serving as the chair of the Community Advisory Board that had successfully navigated the balance between growth and preservation. But the person whose presence meant the most to me was my father, who'd taken early retirement from the grain elevator to become the property manager for Thompson Development Group, the company I'd created to handle my Millbrook real estate investments. "You know," Dad said as we stood together watching the celebration, "when you were 18 and talking about starting a business, I was proud of your ambition, but I was also scared you'd get your heart broken." He paused, sipping his beer and looking around the room at the tangible evidence of what that ambition had ultimately created. "I never imagined that your success would end up lifting up everyone else too. That's not how business usually works, especially around here." "It's not how business has to work," I replied. "But it's how I wanted it to work." The evening's program included updates from various community organizations and businesses, each telling a version of the same story. Measurable improvement in almost every aspect of community life. School enrollment was up 30%. Unemployment was down to 2.1%, the lowest in the county. Property values had increased but remained affordable compared to similar communities closer to Columbus. Crime was virtually non-existent, and volunteer participation in community organizations was at an all-time high. The most significant announcement came from Mayor Patterson. Tom Patterson had been re-elected twice since I'd started the revitalization project, who revealed that Millbrook had been selected as one of Ohio's Communities of Excellence for 2024, a designation that came with state funding for additional infrastructure improvements and tourism promotion. "This recognition doesn't belong to any one person or organization," he said. It belongs to everyone who believed that Millbrook's best days were ahead of us, not behind us. After the formal program ended, people lingered to continue conversations that had started earlier. I found myself moving through the crowd, checking in with various projects and relationships that had developed over the years. Sarah Chen was expanding her bookstore cafe to include a small publishing imprint that would focus on regional authors and local history. Mike Rodriguez had left Adventure Gear Monthly to start his own logistics consulting firm, serving small businesses throughout rural Ohio. Jessica Martinez had moved to Millbrook the previous year to oversee Adventure Gear Monthly's expanded operations, and was already talking about running for city council. But the conversation that mattered most happened near the end of the evening, when Rebecca and I found ourselves alone in the kitchen as she supervised the cleanup. "Marcus," she said, washing glasses with the efficiency of someone who'd spent years in food service, "I need to tell you something I should have said a long time ago." I grabbed a dish towel and started drying. "What's that?" "You were right, about everything. About dreams being worth pursuing, about limitations being negotiable, about the possibility of building something bigger than what you inherited." She paused in her washing. "But more than that, you were right about the difference between running away from something and running towards something." "How so?" "When I told you that you'd never leave this town, I was really talking about myself. I was the one who was stuck, the one who'd given up, the one who couldn't imagine a future different from the past." She rinsed a wine glass and held it up to the light, checking for spots. "You weren't trying to escape Millbrook because you hated it. You were trying to escape the version of yourself that would have been satisfied with settling for less than what you were capable of." It was the most insightful thing Rebecca had ever said about our family dynamics, and it revealed how much she'd grown during the years since our original confrontation. "And now?" I asked. "Now I understand that leaving and coming back aren't opposites. They're parts of the same journey. You had to leave to become the person who could come back and make a difference. You had to prove to yourself that you could succeed in the big world before you could bring that success home." She finished the last glass and turned to face me directly. "I'm proud of you, Marcus. Not just for what you've accomplished, but for how you've accomplished it. You could have stayed in Denver, could have kept building Adventure Gear Monthly, could have become one of those entrepreneurs who gets rich and forgets where they came from. Instead, you came back and shared your success with the people who knew you before you were successful." "I didn't do it to be noble," I said. "I did it because this place shaped me, and I wanted to help shape it in return." "That's what makes it noble," Rebecca replied. The next morning, I drove out to the cemetery where my grandfather was buried. Marcus Thompson had been a machinist at the steel mill for 43 years. A man who'd believed that honest work and family loyalty were the highest virtues a person could aspire to. He'd died when I was 12, before I'd developed any grand ambitions or rebellious streaks. I'd never visited his grave as an adult, but something about reaching this milestone made me want to pay my respects to the man who'd represented everything stable and permanent about Millbrook life. His headstone was simple gray granite with dates that bracketed a life lived entirely within the boundaries of our small town. But as I stood there, I realized that his life hadn't been limited by those boundaries. It had been defined by the contributions he'd made within them. Grandpa Thompson had never started a business or made a fortune or had his picture in magazines, but he'd raised a family, supported his community, and lived with integrity and purpose. He'd found meaning not in escaping his circumstances, but in fulfilling his responsibilities within them. In my own way, I'd done something similar. I'd taken the values he'd embodied, hard work, community loyalty, building something lasting, and applied them on a different scale, in a different context, with different resources. The kid who'd once thought success meant getting as far away from Millbrook as possible had discovered that true success meant being able to choose your relationship with the place that made you. I wasn't trapped in Millbrook anymore, but I wasn't trapped outside of it either. I was free to move between worlds, to build bridges between different versions of myself and different definitions of home. That afternoon, I got a call from Richard Blackstone at Cascade Outdoor Group. He'd been persistent over the years, periodically checking in to see if I'd changed my mind about selling Adventure Gear Monthly. "Marcus," he said, "I know you've been focused on your real estate projects, but I wanted to let you know that our offer is still on the table. In fact, given your company's continued growth, we'd be willing to go as high as $400 million. $400 million. It was an almost incomprehensible amount of money. enough to fund dozens of Millbrook-style revitalization projects, enough to establish a foundation that could transform rural communities across the Midwest. Richard, I said, I appreciate the offer, but I'm still not interested in selling. Can I ask why? You've proven everything you set out to prove. You've built a successful company, you've made a fortune, you've revitalized your hometown. What's left to accomplish? It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself lately. What was the next chapter for someone who'd already exceeded his wildest teenage dreams? I think what's left, I said, is figuring out how to use success responsibly. How to build things that last beyond quarterly earnings reports. How to create value that can't be measured in stock prices or market cap. That sounds very philosophical, Blackstone said with a chuckle. But philosophy doesn't pay dividends to shareholders. Maybe that's the problem with how we think about business, I replied. After I hung up, I sat in my car outside the cemetery for a long time, thinking about the conversation and what it revealed about the choices I'd made over the past decade. Adventure Gear Monthly was worth $400 million, but it was worth more than that to me because it represented proof that you could build something meaningful without compromising your values. Millbrook was a successful real estate investment, but it was worth more than its portfolio value because it represented the possibility of community-centered development. Most importantly, both achievements represented something that couldn't be bought or sold, the satisfaction of having turned potential into reality, of having refused to accept limitations that other people tried to impose, of having built a life that was authentic to my own values rather than someone else's expectations. That evening, I had dinner with my parents at their house on Elm Street, the same house where I'd grown up, where Rebecca had torn apart my business plan, where I'd made the decision to prove that small-town kids could dream as big as anyone else. The house looked exactly the same, but everything else had changed. Dad was happier and more engaged than I'd seen him in years, energized by his work managing properties and overseeing construction projects. Mom was volunteering at the new community center, teaching cooking classes and coordinating social events for seniors. You know, Mom said over dessert, Mrs. Henderson stopped by yesterday. She wanted me to tell you that she's sorry for complaining about those UPS trucks all those years ago. I laughed. She couldn't have known that those trucks were the beginning of something bigger. Maybe not, Dad said, but she knows now. And she's grateful. As I drove home to my own house, a restored Victorian that I'd bought and renovated 3 blocks from where I'd grown up, I thought about the strange circularity of the journey that had brought me back to where I started. The 18-year-old who desperately wanted to escape Millbrook had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. But the 33-year-old who'd chosen to return had discovered something the teenager couldn't have understood, that the best way to transcend your origins isn't to reject them, but to transform them. Rebecca had said I'd never leave this town, and in the most important sense she'd been right. Not because I was trapped here, but because I'd chosen to make this place part of who I was, regardless of where else I might go or what else I might build. I hadn't just proven that a kid from Millbrook could make it big. I'd proven that making it big could include making your hometown big too. And sometimes, that's the most meaningful success of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.